Ancient Greece was not a single nation, but a mosaic of independent city-states that shared language, religion, and a habit of argument. From the palaces of the Bronze Age to the Roman annexation, Greek communities experimented with power, refined citizen armies, and built maritime networks that bound the Aegean to the wider Mediterranean. Our story follows that political and military arc. We will track the emergence of the polis, the discipline of the hoplite line, the confrontation with the Persian Empire, the rise and fall of Athenian sea power, the long Peloponnesian War, and the reordering of the Greek world under Macedon and Alexander. Along the way, we will rely on witnesses as close to events as we can get, above all Herodotus and Thucydides, and on what archaeology, inscriptions, and modern scholarship can confirm or correct. As always, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you are here to unwind, to learn something new, or to drift off while traveling through the past, I am glad you are here. Now, let us begin. Greek history begins on the rim of a narrow sea. The Aegean is a jigsaw of islands and peninsulas, with short rivers, stony soils, and coasts that never wander far from mountains. This landscape did not encourage a single, centralized kingdom. It produced many small communities that looked outward to the water for contact, for trade, and in time for power. Long before classical Athens or Sparta, long before the set speeches of Thucydides, or the measured judgments of later historians, there were palaces on Crete and fortress towns on the mainland whose rulers counted grain rations and bronze fittings, whose craftsmen carved seal stones and cast swords, and whose ships threaded the straits to Cyprus, Egypt, and the Levant. This is the world of the Bronze Age Greeks, whose palaces rose and fell centuries before Herodotus put ink to papyrus. On Crete, archaeologists uncovered the broad staircases, storerooms, and light wells of the palace at Knossos. The place is a maze of corridors and courts, with magazines fitted for hundreds of pithoi that once held wine, oil, and grain. The walls had bright frescoes that show bull leapers, procession scenes, and ritual landscapes. These people wrote a script that we call Linear A. Unlike its mainland successor, it remains undeciphered. They built with skill and a taste for display, yet they left few images of kings as we would recognize them. The old notion of a Cretan sea empire may be more poem than proof, but the island's central position made it a natural broker of goods and styles. Cretan potters supplied distinctive wares to island and coast. Cretan metalworkers hammered blades admired as far as the Egyptian court. The palaces themselves were rebuilt several times, since earthquakes are part of the Cretan story. The eruption on Thera, the island now called Santorini, left deep layers of ash and perfectly preserved frescoes at Akrotiri. The date remains a matter of scholarly debate, with some scientific studies pointing to the middle of the second millennium before the Common Era, and some historical synchronisms suggesting a later window. What is certain is that the eruption disrupted the Aegean world, and that Cretan influence shifted in its aftermath. To the north and west on the mainland, another power rose. We call its people Mycenaeans after the fortress city of Mycenae, where excavations revealed grave circles packed with gold masks, daggers inlaid with lion hunts, and long swords meant for stabbing rather than hacking. In the 16th century before the Common Era, elite families at Mycenae and other centers buried their dead with symbols of authority and wealth that point to a rulership built on war and display. Over the following centuries, They built palaces on hilltops at places whose names still carry weight: Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns, Thebes. They ringed their citadels with walls made from blocks so massive that later Greeks said giants had set them in place. Anyone who stands before the Lion Gate at Mycenae understands the point that these stones were meant to make. The Mycenaeans were telling every visitor that strength and organization lived here. In storerooms at Pylos and elsewhere, scribes recorded the palace economy on clay tablets. In the 1950s, Michael Ventris and John Chadwick showed that the script, known as Linear B, is an early form of Greek. It is one of the great breakthroughs in 20th century scholarship. The tablets speak a sparse administrative language. They tell us of land allotments, of rations for female textile workers, of sacrifices to deities already familiar by name, of allotments of bronze and deliveries of chariot wheels. The palace at Pylos kept detailed counts of pigs, oxen, and perfumed olive oil. The palace was called the place of the Wanax, the Lord, and there was also a war leader called the Lawagaters. Behind these simple administrative registers is the picture of a redistributive court that collected produce and craft goods from its territories and returned some of that yield to specialists and retainers. The system depended on harvests, on long supply chains for tin and copper, and on political control. It was resilient because it could count and command, but it was also brittle because the palaces sat at the center of so many paths. Archaeology reveals the reach of this world. Mycenaean pottery has the stubborn habit of traveling. Sherds and whole vessels appear on Cyprus, in coastal Anatolia, in the Levant, and in the Nile Delta. Texts from the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia mention a Western people whom many scholars identify as the Achaean Greeks. They speak of a place called Wilusa, which may be the city the Greeks later knew as Ilios. One Hittite treaty names a ruler called Alaksandu, whose name may echo the Greek Alexandra form. The point is not that Homer can be read like a field report. The point is that the peoples of the Aegean and Western Anatolia were entangled in diplomacy and war in the 13th century before the Common Era, and that these entanglements left traces in both earth and text. One find brings this web to life as few others can. Off the coast of southern Turkey, near a place called Uluburun, a merchant ship sank in the late 14th century before the Common Era. Divers and archaeologists recovered its cargo piece by piece. There were copper ingots in the shape called oxhide, about 40 ingots in all, enough copper to make thousands of tools or weapons. There were tin ingots, the rarer metal that made bronze possible. There were jars filled with resin, blue glass, ebony, hippopotamus tooth, raw ivory, and luxury items from as far as the Black Sea and Nubia. The ship sailed a circuit that joined kingdoms and ports. The cargo is a map of the Bronze Age world. It shows how much the Mycenaean and Cretan elites depended on far-flung networks of exchange. It also hints at why the system would prove vulnerable when the winds of the world shifted. The palaces burned. In the 12th century before the Common Era, a wave of destruction swept the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean. At different dates that varied by place, the citadels of Pylos, Mycenae, and Tiryns were sacked or abandoned. Linear B tablets from Pylos mention watchers of the coast, which suggests a sense of real danger from the sea. Egypt fought sea raiders whom modern scholars call the Sea Peoples, and the Hittite capital fell. In Greece, the destruction lasted long enough to break the administrative backbone of the palace system. The reasons remain a field of arguments. Earthquakes certainly struck some centers. Climate studies suggest prolonged drought across parts of the eastern Mediterranean that would have created famine and migration pressures. The long circuits of trade that supplied bronze could have frayed. Internal unrest is also plausible, since a system that concentrates wealth and power in a palace invites both dependency and resentment. It is simplest to speak of collapse. It is more accurate to speak of many stresses that converged until the system no longer held. What followed in Greece is often called a dark age. The term is blunt and can mislead. There was light in those centuries. There was change and even renewal. Yet from about 1200 to about 800 before the Common Era, the material record is poorer. Sites are smaller, and writing disappears. The linear B script did not survive once the palaces that required and trained scribes were gone. Economies retracted from palatial redistribution to local production. Settlements shifted from citadels to hamlets and farmsteads. In Messenia, where the great palace of Pylos had dominated life, villages like Nicoria cling to the ridges and cultivate nearby terraces. Pottery styles simplify from the elaborate forms of the late Helladic period to the clean curves and bands of the proto-geometric style. Iron begins to replace bronze for tools and weapons. This is a technical shift with profound implications, since iron does not depend on the same trade routes as tin. The story is not only one of contraction. On the island of Euboea, at a site called Lefkandi, archaeologists uncovered a remarkable building from the 10th century before the Common Era. It is a long hall with a porch and a central space that contained rich burials. One burial held the cremated remains of a man, a woman laid to rest with gold ornaments, and the skeletons of horses. The building was then covered by a mound. This is not a palace in the old sense. It is a sign that some families maintained networks, wealth, and ritual authority long after the palaces fell. Lefkandi also points outward, since Euboean merchants and adventurers later appear at the edges of the Greek world in the 8th century, at places like Almina in Syria and Pithekusai in the Bay of Naples. The people who had found colonial settlements in the Archaic period were already feeling for new routes in the late Dark Age. Across Greece in these centuries, authority was personal and local. Later, Greeks remembered this as the time of the basileus, the chieftain or king who ruled a small community through family ties, counsel, gift exchange, and the loyalty of armed followers. Homer's poems, written down later but likely bearing memories from this world, speak of leaders who dine with their companions and settle disputes at assemblies where elders hold scepters when they speak. The social unit that mattered was the household, the oikos, with its land, storerooms, and kin. Land was the measure of status and security, and disputes over land shaped the politics of small communities. Warfare was limited by the resources of these societies, yet it never ceased. Raids, cattle lifting, and quarrels over borders are part of the fabric of life in oral poems and in the archaeological record of small settlements clustered on hills. Religious life persisted and grew. Peaks and caves on Crete that had been sacred in the palace period continued to draw offerings. On the mainland and islands, sanctuaries began to gather dedications from a widening circle. By the late 9th and 8th centuries, places like Olympia and Delphi were already attracting visitors from beyond a single valley or island. The first Olympic festival was traditionally dated to 776 before the Common Era, a date chosen in antiquity to mark a clean beginning for lists of winners and for the counting of years. The point is less the precision of the number and more the growth of a common calendar that bound many communities through shared rites and competition. The rituals at sanctuaries were local in form, but pan-Hellenic in aspiration. The tripod cauldron dedicated at Delphi and the bronze figurine left at Olympia advertised the presence of a city or a family. These offerings created corridors of connection as surely as ships did. Sometime in the 8th century, the Greeks adopted and adapted an alphabet from the Phoenicians. The great leap was the use of letters to represent vowel sounds. This allowed Greek to be written with a precision that other scripts lacked. The earliest inscriptions are brief. One famous cup found at Pithecusae bears a playful text that mentions Nestor, a figure from the epic tradition, proving that song and writing were already conversing. Another early inscription on a funerary vessel from Athens records that the vessel is a prize for a dancer. These are small texts, yet they show that writing had left the palace offices and entered the public life of communities. The ability to record law, to dedicate a gift with a name and a verse, to inscribe a treaty, and eventually to write down long poems would change the way Greeks remembered and argued. The material culture of the 8th century shows a different energy from the centuries before it. Potters perfected the geometric style with its bands, meanders, and fields of tiny figures. On the largest vases, painters filled the surfaces with funerary scenes and processions. The figures are spare, almost schematic, yet the compositions have a driving rhythm that mirrors other forms of order rising in Greek life. Settlements grew. At Athens, the area around the Acropolis drew more inhabitants. In the Argolid, the hill of Argos remained a focus for life. At Corinth, a settlement on the isthmus took advantage of a position that made it a gate between seas. These centers did not look like the old palaces. They introduced something new, the compact and self-conscious community that the Greeks called the polis. The aftermath of collapse also reordered connections with the wider world. Contacts with Cyprus, the Levant, and Egypt intensified again. Greek craftsmen absorbed motifs from Eastern art, which modern scholars call the Orientalizing movement. Griffins, sphinxes, and palmettes find their way onto Greek pottery and metalwork. This is not imitation. It is exchange and translation. Greek builders learned from Near Eastern craftsmen how to set columns and cut stone for large temples. Greek storytellers absorbed tales that became new myths and new ways to frame old gods. The encounter with older civilizations to the east gave the Greeks models and materials that they turned into their own political and artistic inventions. In this era, the memory of the Bronze Age was fragmented but not lost. Ruined citadels loomed on hilltops. Tholos tombs, like the so-called Treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, still yawned under their earth mounds. Local people must have walked past broken walls and told stories about giants and ancient kings. These stories later hardened into genealogies and heroic cycles. The poems we know as the Iliad and Odyssey were sung and refined by generations of bards before they took written form. They present a heroic world of feasts, raids, and councils that owes more to the Dark Age and early archaic experience than to the palace bureaucracies that Linear B reveals. Yet they carry old names such as Mycenae, Pylos, and Troy, and they remember a time when Greek fighters crossed the sea to a rich city in Asia. The bardic tradition is an archive of experience, edited by song, not by scribes. The shift from small-scale chieftain politics to the more formal institutions of the polis is one of the great transformations in Greek history. Its roots lie in the social practices of the Dark Age. in assemblies that legitimated decisions, in councils of elders, in a warrior ethos that demanded recognition for peer groups rather than room at the table only for one king and his household. As communities grew, the need to manage disputes and to organize defense encouraged common rules and obligations. The rise of the hoplite style of fighting, in which citizens stand shoulder to shoulder with heavy shields and spears, belongs to the next chapter of the story. But the cultural groundwork is laid in the centuries after the palaces fell. The warrior who once earned glory through a raid now earns honor through a place in the line beside his neighbors. Archaeology complements this picture with regional variety. In Boeotia, at sites around Thebes, settlements regroup on lower ground, sometimes within the shadow of earlier citadels. In Thessaly, communities manage the rich plains with patterns that will later support strong cavalry traditions. On the islands of the Cyclades and the Dodecanese, sailors and merchants knit the island world together, so that trends in pottery or burial practice can be traced hopping from Naxos to Paros to Rhodes in sequences that reveal the movement of people and styles. On Crete, traditions that reach back to the palatial period mingle with new forms, creating a local discourse of continuity and change. There was no single Greek experience of the Dark Age. There were many, shaped by geography, old memories, and new opportunities. The political imagination changed as well. The idea that one could begin time from a fixed point, such as the first Olympic victor, created a new sense of shared chronology. The habit of inscribing laws in stone, which appears in the next era, has its parent in the simple act of writing a dedication so that a name cannot be forgotten. The sense that communities could reorganize themselves through agreements rather than only through births and funerals shows in the earliest federations and in alliances that are recorded by the late 8th century. Greece was piecing together new ways to remember, to argue, and to decide. The economy of the Dark Age was leaner than that of the palaces, but it was not moribund. Iron tools were harder and sharper and did not depend on tin shipped from far mines. Pastoralism remained important, and cattle, sheep, and goats shaped both diet and wealth. In some regions, the introduction of new crops and the gradual spread of the olive and vine altered landscapes and patterns of labor. The return of long-distance exchange brought back luxury goods, but many communities remained grounded in the work of farms and craft workshops that served local needs. This mix would define Greek economic life for centuries to come. Even the grand port of classical Athens rested on a countryside of smallholders and tenant farmers. The Greek language changed in these centuries. The Linear B tablets preserve a Bronze Age dialect of Greek. The alphabetic inscriptions reflect local dialects that would later sort into families such as Ionic and Doric. The very fact that the new script could be learned by more than a tiny cadre of palace scribes had consequences. Public texts allowed law and ritual to be shared artifacts. Poetry could be performed with a stability that earlier oral tradition did not possess, even as improvisation and local style continued. With writing came increased capacity to imagine community beyond face-to-face knowledge, because a text could speak for a city to those who were not present when it was composed. The memory of the old world never completely vanished. Greek genealogies, sanctuaries, and heroic tales kept it alive, while profoundly transforming it. At Tiryns, people built houses amid the broken masonry of the old walls. At Mycenae, the grave circle became a focus of later cult. Bronze Age roots and resources left their imprint on later choices about where to farm, where to worship, and where to build. When later Athenians debated their past, they told stories of autochthony and first kings that reached back into a time beyond record. When Spartans fashioned a past for their austere polity, they shaped it to fit a tale of discipline that their landscape and history reinforced. By the close of the 8th century, the outlines of a new Greek world are clear. Communities are larger and more structured. Writing is a commonplace of public life. Sanctuaries bind islands and valleys into networks of reputation and ritual. Ships from Euboea, Corinth, and elsewhere test new sea roads to the west. The warrior line of the polis is forming in practice and in ideal, even before lawgivers and poets give it a formal voice. None of this erases the memory of the palaces or the generations of contraction and change that followed their fall. It is instead the soil from which the archaic age grows, with its experiments in law, colonization, and the military order that will carry Greek citizen armies into collision with the greatest empire of their age. When the palaces had long since fallen silent, and the memory of their scribes had faded, a different pattern of Greek life took shape. It was not centered on a single court. It was not organized around warehouses of counted oil and bronze. It gathered instead in compact communities that claimed a hill and a harbor, a god and a festival, fields and fortifications, law and custom. The Greeks called this community the polis. Later writers would translate that as city-state, but the Greek word is larger than its parts. It is the people in assembly and in arms. It is a territory with boundaries and shrines. It is a calendar that binds neighbors through shared rites. By the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era, the polis had become the frame within which Greeks would debate and fight, trade and colonize, make laws and write poetry, and teach their sons how to stand in the line of battle. The polis did not appear overnight. It grew out of earlier habits of rule and counsel and from local economies that had recovered enough to support larger populations. Archaeology shows how settlements thickened on the ground. In Attica, the area below the Acropolis collected houses and workshops and graves in zones that would later become streets and markets. In the Argolid, Argos drew people away from scattered hamlets. At Corinth, perched on the isthmus between two seas, a town grew that would prosper by taxing and servicing the traffic that moved along that narrow neck of land. These centers consolidated surrounding villages and began to speak with a single voice in matters of war and diplomacy. A political imagination formed along with them. People learned to think of themselves as citizens who belonged to a specific polis and who had duties and rights within it. Religion was the tissue that helped hold these communities together and connect them to their neighbors. Local cults to a patron deity took on civic shape. Athena became the focus of Athens, Hera of Argos and Samos, Apollo of Corinth and Delphi. Sanctuaries became the places where cities displayed their pride and piety. A tripod cauldron left at Delphi carried with it the donor city and its ambition. Pan-Hellenic festivals matured in this period and created a shared calendar for Greeks who spoke in many dialects and lived on many shores. The Olympic Games in the West, the Pythian Games at Delphi, and later the Nemean and Isthmian festivals gathered athletes and envoys as well as offerings. Lists of victors became a way to keep time. Rivalries found a ritual channel even as they looked for more violent expression in open country. The growth of the polis is tied to a change in warfare. In earlier centuries, a notable warrior might win renown through raids or single combat, and prestige followed rich households with followers. In the Archaic Age, a different style of fighting matured. Citizen soldiers in heavy armor stood in close order, with large round shields and long spears. The aim was to keep the line unbroken, to press the opposing line back, to rely on the discipline of neighbors and not on personal heroics. The heavy infantryman was called a hoplite. His shield was called an aspis and was carried on the left arm so that each man partly protected the man to his left. The formation that put them shoulder to shoulder is known as the phalanx. This is not only a set of tactics, it is a social fact. To fight this way, a city needed enough men of means to buy armor and weapons. It needed training and trust. The men in the line defended their farms and their families. The field where two rival citizen bodies met was often a disputed strip of land whose ownership mattered in practical and symbolic ways. We can see the transition in art and poetry. On a fine vase known to scholars as the Chigi vase, made at Corinth in the 7th century, a painter depicted a line of armored men advancing with spears and shields in formal order. At the same time, poets like Archilochus and Tyrtaeus sang of battle as a duty to stand firm rather than to rush forward alone. Tyrtaeus, in particular, is connected by tradition with Sparta and speaks of discipline as the highest virtue. The formation favored men of middling wealth who could afford a panoply but not a horse, and who wanted a voice in how wars were declared and how treaties were signed. The hoplite way of fighting and the polis way of governing were not the same thing, but the two reinforced one another. Different polii pursued different political settlements. Sparta, set in the Eurotas Valley of Laconia, followed one path. Athens, spread across the ridges and plain of Attica, followed another. Both are essential to the story of the archaic age. Sparta lived with a permanent fact that shaped every decision. In the 8th and 7th centuries, Spartans fought the communities of Messenia to the west and eventually conquered them. The conquest was total. The defeated Messenians were reduced to the status of helots, a servile population bound to the land, who farmed and delivered produce to Spartan masters. The result was prosperity for Spartan citizens and a constant danger of revolt. To manage that danger, the Spartans organized themselves into a severe commonwealth. Tradition ascribes this order to a lawgiver named Lycurgus. Whether Lycurgus was a single reformer or the personification of a long process, the institutions attributed to him are clear. Sparta had two kings from two royal houses who led armies and performed rituals. Sparta had a council of elders who prepared proposals. Sparta had an assembly of citizens who voted yes or no. Most striking was the education of Spartan boys in common messes and training grounds that emphasized endurance, obedience, and solidarity. Spartan citizens ate together in mess halls and were discouraged from luxury. Iron bars were said to be used as money to discourage private wealth. Whether the details are exact or part of a later idealization, the fact remains that Sparta achieved a level of social discipline unmatched in Greece. That discipline produced superb infantry and a reputation that made other cities think twice before crossing Spartan interests. Athens faced a different problem. Attica did not hold a large conquered population. It did hold many smallholders who had fallen into debt and whose land and freedom were threatened by the power of richer families. The old aristocratic order, centered on lineage and the holding of offices by birth, struggled to cope with social pressure from below and from middling citizens who had prospered through trade and crafts. In the early 6th century, the Athenians turned to a reformer named Solon. He was a poet as well as a statesman, and left verses that comment on his work and complain about the burdens he had to carry. Solon cancelled debts that were secured on the person. He forbade debt slavery for citizens. He brought back Athenians who had been sold abroad. He reorganized the citizen body into classes defined by annual agricultural yield. The highest class could hold the highest offices. Lower classes could sit in the assembly and in juries. Solon also created a council of 400 citizens to prepare business for the assembly. He did not create a democracy as later Athenians would understand it, but he broke the grip of birth on power and gave poorer citizens a stake in the laws. Solon left Athens for a time to allow his laws to stand without his constant interference. The city then endured a generation of factional conflict. Out of this turmoil emerged a tyrant named Pisistratus. The Greek word tyrannos did not yet carry the full moral weight it would later have. It meant a ruler who had seized power without constitutional title. Pisistratus proved to be a shrewd manager. He kept Solon's laws in force. He taxed lightly. He encouraged festivals and public works. He summoned poets and artists to adorn Athens and promoted the worship of Athena and Dionysus in forms that would shape Athenian identity for centuries. After his death, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus ruled. Hipparchus was assassinated by two young men who became the focus of a proud Athenian legend about love and liberty. Hippias grew harsher and was overthrown with Spartan help. In the aftermath of this fall, in 508 or perhaps 507 before the Common Era, Cleisthenes carried reforms that created the framework of classical Athenian democracy. He broke the citizen body into new tribes based on residence rather than kin. He created demes, which were local units that kept registers and supplied men to the army and the assembly. He expanded the council to 500 members drawn by lot. He weakened the power of local magnates by mixing city, coast, and inland villages into each tribe. He also introduced the practice of ostracism, by which citizens could vote once a year to exile for 10 years a man they thought dangerously ambitious. In short, Cleisthenes created institutions that allowed a large and varied population to govern itself with regularity. These two case studies show how the polis could develop under pressure. Many other cities found their own solutions. Corinth was ruled by a family called the Bacchiads, until a man named Cypselus seized power, and then his son Periander succeeded him. The Cypselid tyranny sponsored trade, built temples, and helped Corinth dominate pottery exports across the Mediterranean. On Samos, in the East Aegean, a tyrant named Polycrates created a small naval power that rivaled Ionian neighbors and bargained with great kings. On Sicily, Greeks from Corinth, Chalcis, and other cities founded settlements that grew into major powers like Syracuse and Acragas. In these places, too, tyrants often presided over public works, wars, and festivals. The word tyrant should not mislead. Many were patrons of building and art and promoted economic expansion. Yet the pattern of one-man rule always posed a question to Greek minds about law and consent. Colonization is a defining feature of the archaic centuries. The word does not mean the kind of overseas empires familiar from modern times. It means that a mother city sent out settlers to found an independent polis with its own land and laws. The decision was often presented to the oracle at Delphi. A leader called an oikist was appointed. The expedition sailed with sacred fire and with the blessing of the gods. The reasons for going were varied. Population pressure might push young men to seek new fields. Political losers might prefer a fresh start. Merchants might chase new markets and resources. The scale was vast. Euboeans and Corinthians dotted the coasts of southern Italy and Sicily with communities. Pithecusae, near Naples, is among the earliest Western settlements and shows bidirectional trade between Greeks and Etruscans. The city of Sybaris on the Italian heel grew rich and celebrated, so much so that later Greeks used its name as a byword for luxury. The Phocians from Ionia sailed as far as the south of Gaul and founded Massalia on a fine harbor that would much later be called Marseille. The Therans and their colonists founded Cyrene on the North African coast. To the east, the Milesians sent out settlers around the Black Sea and raised cities at places like Sinope and Olbia. These new polis transformed the economy of the Mediterranean. Greek pottery, wine, and oil flowed out. Grain, metals, timber, and slaves flowed back. Colonization carried military consequences as well. Syracuse would soon field armies and fleets that could decide the fate of Sicily and sway the balance of power in greater Greek quarrels. The economy of the archaic world was more than farms and pots. The invention of coinage in Western Anatolia and its rapid spread to Greek cities changed how payments and taxes could be managed. The first coins were made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver. They carried marks that signaled their issuing authority. Greek cities adopted the idea and stamped their own symbols. Aeginetan turtles and later owls of Athens are famous examples. Coins simplified the buying of grain for cities and the paying of mercenaries for rulers. They also created a shared language of value that crossed dialect and custom. Art and letters reflect the openness of the period. Potters began to paint monsters and floral scrolls borrowed from the East. Metalworkers filled their work with griffins and palmettes. Builders learned to erect temples with columns that developed into the Doric and Ionic orders. Poetry left the grand scale of epic and became the voice of individual experience. Sappho on Lesbos addressed love and loss with a precision that still startles. Alcaeus, her fellow islander, sang of faction and exile. Archilochus of Paros wrote about the soldier who throws away his shield to save his life and vows to buy another. Hesiod of Boeotia composed Works and Days, a straight talk poem that trains a farmer and his brother in honest labor and sets down a moral order for small communities. He also gave an account of the birth of the gods in the Theogony that set a rough family tree for Greek divinities. These poems are not ornaments. They are windows into a society that is negotiating honor, property, work, and the claims of the gods alongside the demands of law and war. Lawgiving has its own story in this age. Cities experimented with written law to settle disputes and curb feuds. Dracon at Athens is remembered for a code that punished homicide and set procedures that survived into the classical period. Zaleucus of Locroy and Charondas of Catana in the West are associated with early legal traditions in the colonies. Written law does not mean equal law. It means that rules could be carved in stone and displayed, and therefore argued. The capacity to argue on common ground is one of the remarkable qualities of Greek public life, and helps explain how the polis could survive bitter quarrels. Trade and craft grew with political ambition. Corinthian potters dominated exports for a time. Then Attic potters took the lead with black figure painting, and later the red figure technique that allowed more fluid drawing of the human body. Workshops became businesses that trained apprentices and sold to distant markets. Shipbuilding improved. The three-banked warship called the trireme would become central in the next century, and its invention is sometimes credited to Corinth. Whether the exact credit belongs there or to other workshops, the technical progress of hull design, ramming prows, and rowing layouts was real. The sea would soon become the main stage of Greek war. The Archaic period also witnessed the binding of myth to civic identity in a new way. The old heroic tales were rewritten in stone and ritual. Tyrants commissioned epic recitations. Lawgivers attached the gods to civic boards and calendars. Sculptors set patron deities atop city gates. A city that had only recently come together out of villages could claim an anchor in a time before record by pointing to the tomb of a hero or the staff of a god. This was not delusion. It was political art, and it gave citizens a story that was older than any one family and grander than any one victory. There were limits to harmony. Factions within cities fought over land and office. Aristocrats struggled among themselves as often as they pressed down upon the poor. Stasis, the Greek word for civil strife, haunts the literature of the period. Poets complained of betrayals and sudden reversals. In some places, tyrants arose as a remedy for faction and then hardened into oppressors. In others, like Athens, reformers managed to widen participation enough to relieve pressure. Beyond the city walls, Polius competed for territory and for prestige at sanctuaries. The very success of festivals as stages for public display raised the stakes of rivalry. The jealousy of equals is a persistent Greek theme, and it shows here in a political field crowded with many small but proud communities. The Archaic Age closed with Greek cities more numerous, more confident, and more entangled than before. They had fashioned institutions for making decisions together and for equipping armies in common. They had scattered daughter cities across seas and along new coasts. They had accepted a calendar that joined them at fixed intervals for sacrifice and contest. They had found in the hoplite line a way to concentrate the power of the middling classes and to dignify ordered bravery. They had discovered in coinage and contracts new instruments for exchange. They had cultivated a habit of inscription and debate that would arm them for the trials to come. When a great empire from the east looked across the water and weighed whether to extend its rule into Europe, it found on the far shore not one kingdom but many polis. This mosaic did not guarantee unity. It did guarantee that resistance, if it formed, would be rooted in citizens who had learned to govern themselves and to stand together in the field. Before Macedon and Alexander, before Athenian theatres filled with the language of empire, the Greek world confronted a power that seemed to belong to another scale of politics altogether. To understand the shock that Persia delivered to the shores of the Aegean, one must first grasp what the empire of the great king was. Under Cyrus, and then Cambyses and Darius, the Persians gathered dozens of peoples into an administrative order that reached from the Indus to the Aegean and from the highlands of Central Asia to the first cataract of the Nile. Satraps governed provinces. Inspectors known to the Greeks as the eyes and ears of the king reported directly to the court. Royal roads stitched the far-flung districts together, with relay stations that let royal messages travel at a pace unknown to any Greek polis. Gold derricks, stamped with the archer of the king, moved pay and tribute across continents. The empire did not seek uniformity of culture. It wanted loyalty, taxes, and soldiers when called. The Greek cities of Ionia, long accustomed to trade and to a certain independence under Lydian kings, now found themselves one set of ports among many. They retained local elites and their languages, but the ultimate fact of power sat inland at Susa and Persepolis. The first great collision between Greeks and Persia did not begin at Marathon. It began within the Greek world itself. in the Ionian cities on the eastern shore of the Aegean. Around the year 499 before the Common Era, Aristagoras of Miletus, a man of ambition and talent, found himself entangled in a failed attempt to capture Naxos. The expedition was financed and supported by the Persian satrap Artaphanes, brother of King Darius. When the venture collapsed, Aristagoras faced disgrace and danger. He threw the dice that many men have thrown when cornered. He turned against his Persian patrons and encouraged his fellow Ionians to revolt. The spark lit dry grass quickly. Miletus and other cities raised ships and expelled Persian garrisons. They sent envoys across the sea to the mainland Greeks, appealing to kinship and fear. Athens, newly proud after the reforms of Cleisthenes, and Eretria on Euboea sent ships. It was a small force by Persian standards, but the act mattered because it drew the mainland cities into the quarrel. In a bold stroke, the Ionian and mainland Greeks marched inland and burned the lower town of Sardis, the satrapal capital. The citadel held, but the smoke of the burning city rose into a story that would not be forgotten at the Persian court. Darius asked, according to Greek tradition, who these Athenians were, and placed an officer to remind him at dinner to remember the Athenians. It is a scene that Herodotus delights in reporting. Whether or not the detail is exact, the sentiment is faithful to what followed. Persian forces recovered from the surprise and pushed the rebels back to the coast. The decisive naval battle came off Lade near Miletus. A coalition of Ionian fleets faced the Persian squadrons. Courage could not overcome division. Some Ionian contingents lost heart and sailed away. The rest were overwhelmed. In 494, Miletus fell. The Persians dismantled the city's long walls, killed or enslaved many inhabitants, and resettled some survivors inland. The revolt was crushed, but it had changed the mental map of the war. The Athenians had helped burn Sardis. They had declared themselves by their own hand. Darius sent a punitive expedition under his generals Datis and Artaphanes, the younger, across the Aegean. The force moved by island stages, taking hostages and allies as it went. Naxos was burned in a kind of grim repayment. The fleet demanded the submission of cities by asking for earth and water, the formal tokens of surrender to the great king. Many islanders chose prudence. Eretria tried to resist but fell. Its people were carried away into exile within the Persian Empire. The fleet then crossed to Attica, landing at a broad plain called Marathon, which offered good ground for cavalry and a short road inland to Athens. The Athenians faced a decision. They asked Sparta for help, but Spartan religious observance delayed any departure until the next full moon. The Athenians marched out with their hoplite force and a small but faithful contingent from Plataea. The generals debated whether to attack at once or to wait behind fortifications. According to tradition, the decisive voice was that of Miltiades, a man with experience of the Persian world who believed that the risk of waiting outweighed the danger of meeting the enemy in the field. The Athenians advanced across the plain at a run to close quickly with the archers and to bring their own weight to bear. The center buckled under Persian pressure, but the wings turned inward and trapped the enemy between them. The route that followed sent many Persians to their deaths in the marshes or at their ships. Marathon did not end the war. It did end the campaign. The Persian force withdrew after a failed attempt to threaten Athens directly. The psychological effect within Greece was profound. The citizens of a single polis, with one small ally, had withstood a royal army and triumphed. A mound near the field still held the ashes of the Athenian dead in later years. a rare honor that marked how the city regarded that day. Athens learned its own lessons. A politician named Themistocles grasped that the next war would be a war of ships. He persuaded his fellow citizens to use the profits from newly discovered silver mines at Laurion not for individual payments, but to build a fleet of triremes. The trireme was a warship built for ramming, with 3 banks of oars and a sharp bronze beak. It needed trained crews and a complex civic infrastructure to sustain it. Athens embarked on that program with energy. Naval power, once the accessory of tyrants and islanders, was about to become the instrument of a democracy. At Susa, Darius prepared a larger expedition, but death came before it could be launched. His son Xerxes inherited the plan and the resources to carry it out. The scale of the new invasion became a tale in itself. Herodotus, who delights in the catalogues of nations, imagines a host of peoples speaking different tongues and wearing different armor, joined only by the common obedience they owed the king. Xerxes ordered a pontoon bridge across the Hellespont so that his army could march from Asia to Europe dry-shod. He cut a canal through the Athos Peninsula to avoid the treacherous cape that had destroyed a Persian fleet a generation earlier. These works served a practical purpose. They also sent a message that no obstacle, natural or political, could stay the king's will. The Greeks were no less divided than before. Some cities Medized, the Greek term for choosing the Persian side. Others hesitated. A small set committed to resistance and formed what we now call the Hellenic League. Sparta held the command on land. Athens, by virtue of its new fleet, became the keystone of resistance at sea. The first line of defense was planned in northern Greece at the Vale of Tempe, but proved untenable against the scale and mobility of the Persian army. The Greeks fell back to a narrow pass at Thermopylae and to the seas nearby at Artemisium. Thermopylae was a gate between mountain and sea. A small Greek force under the Spartan king Leonidas held the pass, while the fleet faced Persian squadrons in a series of sharp sea fights. For 2 days, the Greeks at Thermopylae repulsed assaults on the narrow front. The terrain forced the invaders to fight in files, where heavy Greek shields and spears had the better of the contest. On the 3rd day, a local man showed the Persians a path through the hills that turned the position. Leonidas dismissed most of the allies and remained with the Spartans and a few others. They fought to the death. In the aftermath, the Persians marched south. The point of Thermopylae was not victory, it was time. It allowed the Greek fleet to continue harassing the enemy and gave Athens the day needed to evacuate its non-combatants by sea. Athens could not be held on land. The city's people were ferried to Salamis and other safer places. The Persians entered and burned temples and houses on the Acropolis. The war would be decided by ships. At sea, the Greeks had 2 strategic options. They could abandon the Saronic Gulf and fall back to the Isthmus of Corinth to guard the Peloponnese. Or they could compel a battle in the Narrows near Salamis, where a smaller fleet might withstand a larger one. Themistocles understood that his city's fate, and perhaps the wider future of Greek independence, demanded the second course. Through a mixture of argument, threat, and deception, he got his way. He even sent a message to Xerxes suggesting that the Greeks were demoralized and would flee, a stratagem meant to press the Persians into the constricted waters at exactly the wrong moment for them. At dawn, the fleets maneuvered within the straits. Greek triremes formed lines by city contingents. The Athenian squadron took the heaviest weight of the fight. In close water, with morning winds and currents adding to confusion, numbers can become a hindrance. Persian attempts to envelop the Greek line turned into collisions among their own ships. Greek vessels struck with their rams and backed water to strike again. Oars snapped, hulls splintered, men were thrown into the sea. Persian marines were brave and numerous, but could not deploy on the narrow decks as they wished. Xerxes watched from a throne on the Attic shore. What he saw was his fleet ground down over the hours until it broke and ran. The Persians could still occupy Attica, but they no longer controlled the sea lanes. Without sea control, the army could not be fed indefinitely so deep in hostile territory. Xerxes withdrew with part of his forces to preserve the core of the empire. He left a strong army under Mardonius to try to finish the job the following year. Mardonius attempted to win Greek allies by offering favorable terms to Athens. The Athenians refused twice, even after a second occupation and destruction of their city. The Hellenic League gathered its armies and marched north. The decisive encounter came on the plains near Plataea in Boeotia. There, under the Spartan regent Pausanias, the largest Greek hoplite force yet assembled faced a Persian army composed of many peoples trained to fight in looser order and to rely on archery and cavalry. The initial days were marked by skirmishes and a Persian attempt to use cavalry to cut Greek supplies. On the day of battle, Greek lines were not yet perfectly formed. But once the heavy infantry came to grips, the advantage was clear. Persian infantry, brave but lightly armored, could not break the wall of shields and bronze. Mardonius fell. The Persian camp was stormed. The Greek victory was complete. On the same day, or so Greek memory held, the Allied fleet fought off Persian squadrons at Mycale on the Ionian coast, and then marched ashore to attack Persian troops guarding an encampment near a sanctuary of Hera. The success at Mycale had more than tactical effect. Greek sailors went from ship to shore and set fire to the Persian palisade. Greek confidence in combined action grew, and the Ionian cities sensed that the balance had shifted. The psychological echo from Plataea and Mycale carried across the Aegean. The invader had been stopped and thrown back. The old certainty that empire must prevail had been broken in the minds of Greek farmers and potters, as well as in the reports of Persian satraps. The wars did not end in a treaty that we can point to with a single named clause, but for practical purposes, the great invasions were finished. The Greeks had discovered two truths that would shape the next generation. The first was that an alliance under Spartan leadership on land and with Athenian ships at sea could defeat a world empire when necessity overruled jealousy. The second was that naval power in the hands of citizens could change the internal life of a city as well as its external policy. Athens emerged from the war with a fleet, with experience in coalition leadership, and with a memory of exile and fire that hardened its resolve. Sparta emerged with enhanced prestige and with suspicion of Athenian ambitions that would haunt every council table. In the seasons after Plataea, Greek expeditions pressed the war in the Aegean. The Athenians under Cimon captured Eion on the Strymon, secured the Hellespont, and helped clear Persian garrisons from Thrace and the islands. The Delian League, an alliance of Greek cities under Athenian leadership, took shape with a treasury first kept on the sacred island of Delos. The stated purpose was to liberate Greeks still under Persian rule and to keep the barbarians away from the Aegean. Ships and tribute began to flow toward Athens. The diverging paths chosen by Sparta and Athens were now set upon firm ground. One would stress land power, a tight citizen body, and caution. The other would lean into the sea, broaden its citizen engagement through naval pay, and learn to think in terms of empire and grain routes. The great quarrels of the next chapter would grow from the soil of these choices. The Persian Wars had revealed something else as well. They had revealed how fragile the Greek world could be when divided, and how powerful it could be when a few cities took the risk to trust one another. The monuments that rose in Athens after the war, the oaths sworn in the Peloponnese, the new colonies planted in the west and north to guard supply, all grew from the shock of seeing temples burned and fields trampled, and from the pride of seeing citizen soldiers and sailors prevail against a king whom men called great. The memory of Marathon and Salamis did not end with the men who fought there. It became part of the Greek imagination of freedom and part of the justification for future harshness when Greeks turned their weapons upon one another. For now, though, as the smoke of the last battles drifted away, a generation looked out upon a sea that belonged to them and to their allies, and they began to argue not about survival, but about leadership. When the smoke of the Persian Wars cleared, the Athenians looked upon a city that had been burned twice and a fleet that had saved the Greek mainland. Their walls were blackened, their houses scorched, their temples toppled, yet their harbor was full of ships, and their people were now a sea power beyond anything Greece had known. From this mixture of ruin and mastery, Athens fashioned a new political project. It was called an alliance at first. Soon it became an empire. Out of that empire came wealth, confidence, and monuments that still draw the eye of the world. Out of that empire also came fear, resentment, and the long quarrel with Sparta that would close the century in horror. The instrument of Athenian power was the Delian League. Its ostensible purpose was straightforward. Greek cities would band together to keep Persia out of the Aegean and to liberate those communities still under Persian control. The treasury was placed on sacred Delos, the island of Apollo. Each member city provided ships or money according to an assessed quota. Aristides the Just, one of the heroes of Marathon, was said to have overseen the first assessment. In practice, the league rested on the Athens of Salamis. Athenian sailors and Athenian triremes set the tempo, and Athenian admirals led most expeditions. If the league had remained a loose defensive pact, the story would have ended there. It did not remain loose for long. The early campaigns of the league were led by Cimon, son of Miltiades. He was a patrician in bearing, generous with private wealth, and a gifted commander. He cleared the last Persian garrisons from the Hellespont, secured the grain routes that fed Attica, and took Eion on the Strymon. His greatest victory came on the southern coast of Asia Minor at the Eurymedon River. There, a combined Persian fleet and army waited to challenge the Greeks. Cimon took the Persian fleet at sea and beat it so thoroughly that he then landed his hoplites and defeated the army on the same day. The triumph broke the back of Persian naval power in the Aegean for a generation. It also confirmed a new political fact. Athens could carry war far from home and could dictate terms to those who hesitated. When island members such as Naxos tried to leave the League, Athenian fleets appeared and forced them back into line. Tribute was no longer simply a common defense fund. It became revenue that could be counted and expected. Empire is a habit as well as a policy. The habits of empire grew in Athens with every sailing season. The Council of 500 managed the flood of allied business. In the Agora, clerks kept tablets of the tribute lists and of the decrees that regulated weights, measures, and coinage among the allies. Cleruches were planted on allied land. A klerouki was a special kind of settlement. The men who received lots remained Athenian citizens and kept their places in the Athenian levy, but they farmed abroad and served as a garrison on soil that had once been an ally's. The islands learned the lesson quickly. There was a cost to autonomy when you depended on Athens for security at sea. At home, the political complexion of Athens shifted. Cimon was an admirer of Sparta and saw merit in cooperation between the two leading cities. He arranged the return of Spartan prisoners taken at the Battle of Plataea and recommended to the Athenians that they continue to honor Sparta's leadership on land. His fortunes declined after a disaster that revealed how little trust existed between the two states. Sparta called for help against a Helot revolt that had broken out after an earthquake. Athens sent troops led by Cimon. When the Spartans grew suspicious of their intentions, they dismissed the Athenian force while keeping others. The insult stung. In the assembly, men who wanted to lean into the sea power and to distance Athens from Spartan influence gained the upper hand. Chief among them were Ephialtes and a younger politician named Pericles, who came from an old family and had an education that would make him one of the finest orators in Greek history. Ephialtes led a reform that stripped the ancient Areopagus Council of many of its powers. For generations, the Areopagus had been a stronghold of aristocratic authority. It reviewed laws, supervised magistrates, and could impose fines. Ephialtes transferred much of that oversight to the Council of 500 and to the people's courts. The courts were staffed by large juries drawn by lot from the citizen body and paid a small fee for service, which allowed poorer citizens to sit. The assembly, the council, and the juries together formed the beating heart of the democracy. The Areopagus retained jurisdiction over homicide and some sacred matters. The reform did not erase tradition. It relocated political gravity toward the institutions most closely tied to the citizen mass. Ephialtes was assassinated not long after. His work remained. Pericles grew into leadership through skill rather than speed. He spoke rarely, but always with crafted force. He cultivated a public image of restraint. He rejected offers of private feasting and gifts, and led a simple personal life, which kept his opponents from painting him as corrupt. He found his strategic theme early and never let it go. Athens would be a maritime commonwealth protected by long walls and by its fleet. It would cultivate allies who owed their lives to Athenian oars. It would shape the Aegean so that grain from the Black Sea could reach Piraeus without fear. It would also spend money on public buildings and on civic pay so that the citizens who rode and judged would feel the state as a benefactor and not only as a master. In the years around the middle of the 5th century, the treasury of the League was moved from Delos to the Acropolis. The official reason was security. The political result was unmistakable. Tribute from the allies now crossed the quays at Piraeus and climbed the sacred way to a storehouse in the center of Athens. With that income, the city paid rowers and jurors, maintained ships and docks, and began a building program whose ambition was religious, artistic, and political all at once. The Parthenon rose on the rock of the Acropolis in a burst of disciplined labor. Architects and masons laid out a Doric temple with subtle curves and corrections that give it a living poise. Inside stood the gold and ivory statue of Athena made by the sculptor Phidias. The goddess held a figure of victory in her hand and wore a helmet with sphinx and griffins. The statue's gold plates could be removed in time of need. The Propylaea gateway began not long after, turning the approach to the sanctuary into a ceremony of stone. The temple of Athena Nike and the Erechtheion with its caryatid porch would complete the ensemble in later years. The surface of the city was being remade in marble to declare that the power that had saved Greece now honored its gods with equal greatness. At sea, Athens translated money into command. The fleet grew to hundreds of triremes. Every ship required around 200 men, which meant that thousands of citizens and resident foreigners earned pay as rowers and marines. This created a new social reality. In a hoplite army, men of property could claim that they carried the main burden of war and therefore deserved the main voice in law. In a naval empire, the poorest citizens could argue that they had pulled Greece to safety with their oars and therefore had a right to shape policy. Pericles was not the inventor of this logic. He was its most persuasive voice. He encouraged payment for jury service and for attendance at some public functions. He also instituted the citizenship law of 451, which limited citizenship to those born of 2 citizen parents. The measure curbed marriages of convenience with wealthy foreigners and also narrowed access to the benefits of the state. It would have consequences for family strategies and for the sense of who counted as Athenian for a century to come. The empire expanded and sometimes overreached. Athens became entangled in Egypt when an anti-Persian revolt tempted the League to strike at a soft place. An Athenian force sailed into the Nile Delta to support the rebel Inaros. At first, the campaign went well. Persian counterattack trapped the Greek contingent on an island near Memphis, and after a long siege, the force was destroyed. A relief fleet was also lost. The disaster shocked the city. Tribute obligations were tightened and Allied oversight grew more rigorous. The League might be an alliance in name, but in practice it now looked like an Athenian administration stretched over many towns. Conflicts with Greek rivals also flared. The so-called First Peloponnesian War saw Athens and its allies maneuver against Corinth and its Peloponnesian partners. Battles at Tanagra and Oenophyta gave and took ground in central Greece. The Athenians had to accept that Sparta remained formidable on land. They drew the strategic conclusion that defined their policy for a generation. The city built the long walls that connected Athens to Piraeus and to the older harbor at Phaleron. These fortifications turned the city and its port into a single fortified unit. So long as the fleet commanded the sea lanes, and so long as grain and timber could enter Piraeus, the city could afford to yield fields to invading hoplites and stand fast behind circumvallated stone. Walls do not think, but they express a decision. Athens chose salt water and stone over hedgerows and outlying farms. By the later 450s, the balance of the Greek world tilted again. Cimon returned from ostracism and fought for Athens in campaigns that kept Persia away from the Aegean. The Greeks claimed a formal peace that prevented Persian ships from entering the Aegean and set boundaries in Asia from which Persian troops would keep away. Modern scholars argue over the exact terms and even over the existence of a formal treaty, but there is no argument about the fact on the sea. Persia ceased to be an active naval presence in Greek waters for decades. The rivalry that mattered was now the old one between Athens and Sparta, sharpened by Athenian growth. Pericles was the face of this era. In a great funeral oration recounted by Thucydides, he praised the city as a place where power and culture met, where poverty did not prevent participation, and where courage came from choice rather than compulsion. It is a civic poem as well as a speech. The same man who could celebrate Athens as a school for the Greeks could order a fleet to subdue Samos when that wealthy island defied the League. The siege was long and costly. When Samos fell, its walls were raised, and tribute demands were increased. Euboea revolted and was brought to heel. In both cases, the message was plain. Defiance of Athens within the League would be met with force. The allies were now subjects in the eyes of many Athenians, and the flow of silver to the Acropolis was secured by more than paper decrees. The economy of Athens became intertwined with imperial administration. The so-called coinage decree, passed some years after the transfer of the treasury, required many allies to use Athenian weights and measures, and to mint coinage to the Athenian standard, or to rely upon the Athenian owl. This simplified commerce across the League and gave Athens control of seigniorage and of the monetary language of exchange. Contract law in the city's courts gained reach because merchants from allied ports needed judgments from a central place whose currency and language were common. The city's craftsmen benefited, as did its shipyards and dock workers. Grain imports were secured by garrisons at the Hellespont and by friendly ports along the route to the Black Sea. Timber for shipbuilding came from Thrace and Macedonia. Athens presented itself as a hub for a world of trade and law and performance. Art, drama, and the new discipline that would become philosophy thrived in the same years. Tragedians staged plays before a citizen audience that had fought at Salamis or buried fathers from the campaign lists. Aeschylus presented the Persians, a drama that imagines the court at Susa receiving news of the defeat at Salamis, and turned victory into an exercise in compassion as well as triumph. Sophocles and Euripides followed with plays that explored law, family, and the demands of gods who are not easily pleased. Sculptors refined the human form into a balance of muscle and mind. Vase painters developed the red figure technique to draw bodies in motion and gesture. The building program on the Acropolis employed artists and artisans from across Greece and beyond. Music and recitation were woven into civic festivals that had been reshaped by the city's leaders to be the shared pride of thousands. None of this erased the hard edge of Athenian power. When a small island such as Thasos defied tribute, a siege followed. When Potidaea, a colony of Corinth but a member of the League, hesitated between its mother city and its obligations to Athens, soldiers were sent, and a costly campaign began that would contribute to the strain with Corinth. When settlers from Athens founded Amphipolis near the Strymon to secure timber and silver, they were staking a claim in the north that would put them in direct contact and conflict with Thracian princes and Macedonian kings. The empire was a network of debts and demands that had to be renewed every year by sailings and inspections. The board of 10 treasurers of Athena watched over the tribute accounts and were themselves watched by auditors. The city had invented an imperial bureaucracy fit for a democracy that loved to argue and to count. Sparta watched and waited. The 30 years' peace, concluded after a long cycle of skirmishes, was meant to stabilize the two spheres of influence. It confirmed that Athens would stay out of the Peloponnese and that Sparta would leave the Athenian Empire alone. It also contained clauses about arbitration and the freedom of allies to switch allegiance only under specified conditions. On paper, it brought respite. In the behavior of the states, it brought a truce that felt temporary to men who had become used to seeing adversaries at every border. Corinth, proud and powerful, chafed at Athenian control of routes through the Saronic Gulf. Megara, nestled on the isthmus between Attica and the Peloponnese, became a lodestone for dispute. Athenian trade sanctions against Megara, remembered as the Megarian Decree, hardened tempers and convinced many Peloponnesians that Athens intended to use economic leverage to starve its enemies into submission. Pericles insisted that Athens had the right to deal as it saw fit with its own war and peace. His opponents argued that he was steering the city toward collision out of pride dressed as principle. The strength of Athens in these years can be measured not only in stone and silver, but in confidence. Citizens believed that their laws were a common creation and their city a common work. Men who would never sit as generals could sit in judgment on generals when they returned from a campaign. The poor had a share in decisions because ships needed their arms, and because pay gave them time away from workshops and fields to attend the assembly. Women were excluded from political speech and from the law court. Yet women of citizen families shaped alliances through marriage and managed households that were the backbone of the Athenian economy. Slaves performed labor in mines and on estates and supported the rhythm of urban life. Resident foreigners, the metics, carried on much of the trade and craft and paid special taxes for the privilege of living in the city without citizenship. All of this produced a complicated commonwealth whose vigor astonished visitors and whose contradictions would give later critics no end of material. Pericles held the city to a strategic line. Do not fight Sparta on open ground. Do not scatter the fleet in distractions. Keep the long walls intact and the storehouses full. Use the empire to pay the men who make the empire possible. Trust the sea. Tombstones for Athenian settlers in the north and for sailors lost near Cyprus remind us that policies are carried out by lives. Yet for all the cost, the system held through raids and sieges and occasional setbacks. It also created the setting in which the great crop of thinkers we associate with classical Athens could ask their questions. Socrates began to walk the streets, challenging young men to define justice. The medical writers of the Hippocratic tradition examined the body with a new confidence in observation. Historians began to write in a way that wanted cause and evidence more than stories from the gods. Thucydides learned his craft in this city, even as he would later judge it with an icy eye. By the time war settled again upon Greece, Athens had remade itself. The walls were not merely defenses. They were a statement that the city was a creature of its harbor and its ships. The Acropolis was not only a sanctuary, it was an archive of victory and a ledger of tribute turned into marble. The assembly was not only a meeting, it was an engine that could decide the fate of islands and kings. The name Pericles became a shorthand for a generation. He was praised for vision and condemned for arrogance, praised for generosity to citizens and blamed for meanness to allies, praised for keeping the strategic focus and blamed for provoking the wrong enemies. He stood on a crest. From that crest, the view was dizzying and the drop steep. The thunderheads that would break over Attica were already gathering on the horizons of Corinthian pride and Spartan fear. Grain ships still came and went through the Saronic waters. Rowers still trained on the benches, with their oars braced and their eyes on the Calustes who beat time. Stonecutters still polished columns and set triglyphs with quiet discipline. In halls where magistrates counted tribute and argued cases, the words of law continued to flow. It is easy from a later vantage to pretend that every Athenian felt the tremor of coming catastrophe. People in the moment do not live inside prophecy. They live inside chores, paydays, festivals, and the next sailing. They enjoyed the city they had made, and many believed that the institutions they had forged could weather any storm because they had already beaten the great king himself. That belief would soon face its harshest test. War did not fall on Greece like a surprise storm. It was argued into being. It was prepared step by step in the corridors of city councils and in the stone theatre of the Athenian assembly, in the Spartan king's messes and in Corinthian merchants' counting rooms where ships and tolls were weighed against pride. The 30 years' peace had promised a generation of quiet. In practice, it froze a tense map. Athens ruled the sea, guarded by long walls and tribute. Sparta ruled the Peloponnese and the plains of Laconia and Messenia, with allies bound by solemn oaths and by fear of Spartan spears. Between these two powers stood Corinth, prickly and prosperous, jealous of sea lanes and resentful of Athenian customs inspections. Megara sat on the land bridge between Attica and the Peloponnese, small but crucial. The spark that set the forest alight came from disputes that would have been minor in another age. In this age, each quarrel fed a deeper suspicion. Corinth first complained about Athenian interference at Corcyra, a colony that had grown rich and proud and no longer obeyed the mother city. A quarrel at Epidamnus drew fleets into battle. Athens chose to support Corcyra, not as a formal ally at first, but as a helper under a defensive pact. When Athenian ships appeared at a sea fight near Sybota and saved Corcyra from a crushing defeat, Corinth saw a line crossed. Next came the Potidaea affair. Potidaea was a Corinthian colony and also a member of the Athenian League. Athens demanded that Potidaea tear down its seaward defenses and dismiss Corinthian magistrates. Potidaea refused, declared rebellion, and was besieged. To Corinth, these acts proved that Athens meant to grind down any link that did not serve its interests. To Athens, these acts were the defense of a hard-won system in which allies could not be allowed to change sides at will. Megara then found itself shut out of Athenian markets and harbors under a decree remembered as the Megarian Sanctions. The precise legal grounds were debated even then. The political effect was obvious. Megarian merchants suffered, and the Peloponnesian League heard in the decree the voice of a city that meant to use sea power to enforce its will in every corner of Greece. Corinth pressed Sparta to act. Spartan kings led citizen soldiers who believed that their honor and the safety of their order required them to check Athenian growth. The ephors canvassed allies. In a debate reported in Spare, strong prose by Thucydides, the Spartans voted that the Athenians had broken the peace and that war was justified. Pericles urged Athens to be clear-eyed. He told the assembly that Sparta was strongest on land and that Athens must fight a maritime war. He set the strategy that would define the first phase. Do not meet Sparta in the open field. Bring rural populations within the long walls. Let Spartan invasions burn Attic farms while the navy raids the Peloponnese. Keep the fleet intact. Guard the grain routes. Trust time and money. The plan required discipline at a scale new to Greece. Citizens whose grandfathers had measured status by their olive groves now had to watch enemies cut those groves without charging out to meet them in a single decisive set piece. The city emptied the plain into the urban bowl. Crowding and poor sanitation followed. Sparta invaded under King Archidamus. The first invasion swept across Attica like a slow-moving storm. Fields were trampled, farmhouses torched, orchards hacked. Ash drifted over the city walls as refugees found places to sleep under colonnades and along crowded streets. The fleet answered. Athenian squadrons harried the Peloponnesian coastline, landed marines to burn sheds and seize cattle, and returned to Piraeus with trophies and bitterness in equal measure. The war had begun in the form that Pericles predicted. It soon departed from his script in a way no strategist could foresee. Plague arrived. The exact disease remains debated. The effect was recorded by an observer who watched and suffered and then set down a clinical description, unlike any earlier in Greek literature. Thucydides wrote of fever, unending thirst, rashes, and a moral panic that came when people lost the will to care for the sick and the dead. The crowded city was a perfect host. The plague came in waves, the first and most deadly in the second year of war. Thousands died, among them Pericles' own sons. Pericles himself fell in the third year, after holding firm to his line through abuse and despair. The city he led had mounted the fleet and built the walls that saved Athens in the last war. Now it reeled without the man who could give a policy its steady voice. Athens fought through the illness and through the wish for an easier path. Demagogues rose who promised gains without patience. Enemies in the city found new listeners, yet the institutions Pericles supported survived the loss of his person. The assembly met, the council prepared business, the courts judged, and the fleet sailed. Athens found a new advantage far from Attica. On the western coast of the Peloponnese, a daring expedition under Demosthenes fortified a craggy point at Pylos. Spartan hoplites were cut off on the island of Sphacteria across the bay. What had begun as a raid turned into a siege. When the Spartans tried to recover the position, Athenian light troops and marines harassed them from rough ground where heavy armor and strict drill could not secure victory. After weeks of skirmishing and supply runs under fire, the Athenians forced a surrender. For the first time in memory, a Spartan detachment of chosen men laid down their shields and gave up their spears. Prisoners were marched to Athens. The city enjoyed a moral triumph as well as a practical one, since it could now threaten to execute Spartan captives if Laconian raids returned to Attic fields. In the same years, the war shifted to northern Greece. A Spartan officer named Brasidas gathered a force and marched through Thessaly toward the Chalcidice and Thrace. He was an unusual Spartan, quick in movement and persuasive with words. He promised liberation to cities weary of Athenian garrisons and tribute. He took Acanthus without a fight and then persuaded Amphipolis, the Athenian colony that guarded timber and mines near the Strymon, to open its gates. The news shook Athens. Thucydides himself was sent as one of the generals to the region, but arrived too late to save Amphipolis, and later was exiled for the failure. In a sharp action near the city, Brasidas defeated a force under the Athenian Cleon, who had come north with promises to recover everything that had been lost. Both commanders fell in the fighting. Their deaths created a strange opening. The most aggressive voices on both sides were gone at the same moment. The Peace of Nicias was signed after long negotiation. It was supposed to last 50 years. It returned many captured places to their pre-war status and arranged for the exchange of prisoners. Athens gave up Pylos in time. Sparta promised to restore Amphipolis, but could not compel compliance from allies. The letter of the peace was never fully realized. Its spirit was weaker still. While diplomats tried to hold the middle line, the old pressures worked in the joints of the treaty. Athens and Sparta formed separate alliances with potential swing powers. Corinth and Argos plotted. The party in Athens that hoped for gains saw in the treaty only a pause. A new figure came to dominate debate in the city. Alcibiades was brilliant, handsome, and restless. He was connected to noble families and had been a ward of Pericles in youth. He carried himself as if the city were his instrument. he urged a grand design. Do not wait for the Peloponnese to weaken. Carry the war to Sicily, where the wealth of Syracuse could be tapped and where alliances might tip the balance of the entire Greek world. Sicily had been part of earlier Athenian calculations. Grain and timber could be drawn from its lands. A foothold there could outflank the Peloponnese. Many argued that it was folly to open a new theater while the old war had not been resolved. Many also feared that inaction would squander Athenian energy. The assembly voted for the expedition. 3 commanders were appointed. Alcibiades had the vision. Nicias had the caution and the respect of the older citizens. Lamachus had courage and a clear soldier's mind. Before the fleet sailed, a religious scandal shook the city. Stone markers called herms, set at cross streets and doorways, had their faces mutilated at night. Panic seized Athens. Enemies of Alcibiades accused him of sacrilege in a private setting and claimed that he had mocked the sacred mysteries. Alcibiades demanded an immediate trial so he could clear his name before departure. His enemies maneuvered to delay judgment until after the armada had sailed. The fleet put out in glory, with thousands of rowers, hoplites, and archers, and a show of silver and confidence that took even proud Athenians aback. Not long after, a messenger recalled Alcibiades to stand trial. He slipped away and fled to the Peloponnese, and then to Asia. In a twist that would make any chronicler shake his head, he offered counsel to Sparta, and later would do the same for Persia. Athens had sent its greatest expedition into a distant war, after stripping away the most forceful and inventive of its commanders. Nicias hesitated at Syracuse. Lamachus urged an immediate assault. The moment passed. The Athenians ringed the city with siege works, but Syracusan counterwalls and spirited sorties slowed the noose. Sparta responded to pleas from Corinth and Syracuse by sending an advisor to Sicily. The choice was fateful. They sent Gylippus, a commander who understood the need for speed and resolve. He gathered Sicilian allies and attacked the Athenian lines. The Athenians were now fighting not a city but a coalition. After months of struggle, the assembly at home made a further choice that compounded the risk. It sent a second great fleet under Demosthenes and Eurymedon to finish the job. The relief force arrived and launched bold night attacks on the Syracusan positions. Confusion in the dark turned bravery into disaster. The Athenians were driven back. Sickness ate at the army. Nicias, who had never wanted the expedition, now could not bring himself to cut his losses and withdraw. The navy attempted to force a breakout from the great harbor. Syracusan ships, newly confident and well-handled, blocked the exit with booms and fought with rams and grappling hooks. Athenian sailors faced an enemy who had learned their methods and found ways to blunt them in confined water. The last attempt failed. In a crushing scene described with cold clarity by Thucydides, the Athenians abandoned their ships and tried to march out overland. Syracusans harried them until the army broke. Nicias and Demosthenes were captured and executed. Thousands of Athenians were penned in stone quarries, where many died of exposure and hunger. The greatest undertaking in Athenian history ended in ruin that no one could deny or spin. Sicily broke the back of Athenian self-belief. It did not finish the war. Sparta took the measure of the moment. Under King Agis, they fortified Decelea in northern Attica and kept a permanent garrison there. The effect was immediate. Athenian farmers who had crept back to tend neglected land now had enemy patrols in their faces. Transport by land became chancy. Silver from the Laurian mines could not be raised easily. Slaves deserted in large numbers to the Spartan camp. The city still held the sea, but the cost of holding it rose every month. Allies saw a chance to shake off the empire. Chios revolted. Rhodes moved. Euboea hesitated. The war entered an Ionian phase in which sea battles along the coast of Asia Minor and the Hellespont would decide whether Athens could keep paying crews and feeding citizens. Persia returned as a presence, not with armies of its own, but with money. The satrap Tissaphernes and the Prince Cyrus, brother of the Persian king, saw that by funding Peloponnesian fleets they could weaken Athens and then play the Greeks against each other. Spartan admirals received pay for rowers and timber for hulls. They also received advice that made them slow and quarrelsome in some seasons, swift and united in others. Alcibiades, the exile who now spoke to satraps, counseled delay when it suited Athens, and urgency when it did not. In this murk, the Athenian democracy suffered a crisis at home. Oligarchic plotters in the fleet and in the city argued that only a narrower government could restore order and woo Persian money for their side. The 400 seized power in Athens. The fleet at Samos refused to accept the coup and declared that it was the city. Alcibiades, now turned again toward Athenian interests, worked with the sailors to steady operations. Within months, the 400 fell, and a broader but still conservative regime of the 5,000 replaced them. Soon after, full democracy was restored. The city had come near to losing not only empire, but its soul. The rowers of Samos had kept both afloat. At sea, the Athenians proved that skill and courage had not deserted them. They defeated Peloponnesian squadrons at Cynossema and Abydos, and then won a more decisive victory at Cyzicus, where they destroyed a fleet and took control of the Propontis. For a brief span, grain flowed again through the Hellespont, and citizens dared to speak of recovery. Athens even recaptured Byzantium for a time. The trireme could still be a fine instrument when handled by men who grew up on its benches. But the war had become a contest of endurance, and endurance required three things that were slipping from the city's grasp. It required money to pay crews, goodwill among allies to supply stations and timber, and leaders whose judgment could rise above faction. The end came not on a grand field, but on a quiet shore. The Spartan commander Lysander, who had a talent for discipline and for bargaining with satraps, rebuilt the Peloponnesian fleet with Persian gold. He trained rowers until his squadrons could match Athenian drill. He shifted harbors quickly so that his enemies could not pin him down. At Aegospotami on the Hellespont, the Athenian fleet anchored on a beach without a proper harbor, across from Lysander at Lampsacus. Day after day, the Athenians rowed out and offered battle. Day after day, the Spartans refused. Supplies were short on the Athenian beach. Men wandered to forage. On the final day, Lysander struck when the Athenian ships lay hauled up and the crews were scattered. The result was a rout at a level of disaster not seen before in Greek naval war. Only a handful of Athenian ships escaped. The grain road closed. The noose tightened around Piraeus and the long walls. Athens held out through hunger. Envoys went to Sparta and came back with terms. The city would pull down the long walls to the sound of Spartan flutes. It would surrender its remaining ships except for a small number. It would accept the leadership of Sparta in foreign affairs. In the spring that followed the year 404, before the Common Era, the city that had boasted of being a school for Greece watched its walls fall. Crowds gathered in joy in many allied cities. Others watched with a quieter sadness, knowing that a maritime balance had been broken and that a land power now held the roads of Greece. Sparta installed a board of 30 men to oversee Athens. They are remembered as the 30. Some among them were hard men who purged opponents and took property. Others were idealists of a narrow stripe who believed that a tight oligarchy could tame the city's passions. In less than a year, the bloodletting and confiscations provoked exile and armed resistance. Thrasybulus led a band that seized a fortified post at Phyle, then moved to the Piraeus and faced Spartan-sponsored forces. In a skirmish, the Spartan king Pausanias saw that Athens would not be pacified by terror. He brokered a settlement that restored a broad democracy and granted an amnesty that remains one of the more remarkable political acts in Greek history. Vengeance was limited. The city tried to pull itself back from the edge of a cycle of reprisals that could have emptied every house of its men. Out of these years of defeat came smaller stories that add weight to the whole. Socrates, who had served as a hoplite and who had stood immovable in a retreat at Delium according to those who knew him, was charged a few years later with impiety and with corrupting the young. His trial and death remain an emblem of the city's uncertainty and sorrow as it tried to make sense of responsibility after war. Lysander set up boards of 10 in many other cities and tried to turn the Peloponnesian League into a true Spartan sphere. Spartan Harmosts, military governors, sat in allied towns. Ally became subordinate. Persia reaped influence along the coast it had lost a century earlier. Now, not by garrison but by subsidy. Greek soldiers marched as mercenaries in a Persian civil war when Cyrus the Younger tried to seize the throne and fell at Cunaxa. The famous 10,000 fought their way north through hostile country and reached the Black Sea, shouting with joy when they saw water. The episode, recorded later by Xenophon, shows a Greece of freelancers and weary veterans rather than a Greece of citizen levies standing on their own soil. The war had lasted for a human generation. It had begun with speeches about honor and treaties and national character. It ended with a city humbled, another city anxious burdened with new power, and a third city, Corinth, resentful that its urgings had created a Spartan empire more grasping than the Athenian system it had hated. Contempt for that new hegemony would soon bring new alignments that few would have predicted when the first invasions crossed into Attica. At the same time, a new power watched from the north. Macedonian kings had been learning Greek habits of war and speech for decades. They were still thought rustic by many in the south. They held timber and horses and gold. Out of their courts would come a man who understood how to combine a levy of farmers with a professional class of soldiers and how to harness city grudges to a wider aim. While the Greeks counted their dead and argued their cases, the groundwork of that future was being laid beyond Thermopylae. The end of the Peloponnesian War did not restore balance to the Greek world. It removed one weight and set others sliding. Sparta, stern and victorious, tried to turn leadership into control and found that it had neither the money to maintain garrisons nor the patience to manage quarrels that had been sharpened by a generation of fighting. Harmosts sat in other people's cities. Boards of 10 took orders from Laconian officers. Allies became subjects in all but name. In the West, the naval power Sparta had never truly mastered had to be purchased with Persian silver, and when Persian policy shifted, the ships drifted with it. Resentment gathered. The Corinthian War followed, a tangle of alliances in which Athens, Corinth, Argos, and Thebes fought against Sparta with Persian support. Fleets clashed off Cnidus, and Spartan sea power cracked. On land, hoplite lines pushed and broke with no final decision. the king's peace came down like a document from another world. The Persian monarch declared that the Greek cities of Asia belonged to him and that the rest of Greece should be autonomous. The Greek police, exhausted and compromised, stood beneath the umbrella of a foreign king's guarantee. From this uneasy settlement rose Thebes. The Boeotian city had long been formidable in the countryside and odious to many of its neighbors. A daring coup seized the Cadmea from a Spartan garrison. Thebes then fielded a citizen army that drilled and thought with an originality rare among Greeks. The statesman-general Epaminondas formed a deep column on the left and led with it to crush the Spartan right at Electra. The Spartan mystique, already battered by the surrender on Sphacteria and by the dependence on silver from Asia, shattered when citizen corpses lay thick beneath Boeotian spears. The Thebans marched south, entered Laconia, and freed the Helots of Messenia, where a new fortified city was founded to anchor independence. Sparta's population of full citizens had dwindled. Its system could not supply the losses or recover the prestige. Thebes strode at the center of Greek politics for a decade. Epaminondas died at Mantinea, and with him the coherence of Theban strategy. No city now possessed the strength or legitimacy to command the rest. While this cycle of hegemony and collapse played out in the south, a kingdom watched from the north with careful eyes and sharper needs. Macedon had been part of the Greek story for centuries, a land of plains and mountains where horsemen and farmers lived under kings who traced their line to Argos and who sent athletes to Greek games to prove their Hellenic standing. The court at Aigai and later at Pella spoke Greek, hunted in royal preserves, and bargained with tribes beyond the passes. Yet Macedon remained vulnerable to Illyrians raiding from the west and to Thracians pressing from the east. Its economy rested on timber, stock, and the gold and silver of the hills. Its politics rested on the king's ability to unite noble houses around campaigns that paid in plunder and prestige. In the middle decades of the 4th century, a king came to the throne who possessed the character and luck to turn this frontier realm into the mainspring of Greek affairs. Philip, later called Philip II, had spent part of his youth as a hostage in Thebes after a Macedonian defeat. The captivity was not a dungeon. He lived in the house of Parmenes and watched Epaminondas plan and drill. He saw what a professional cadre could do with citizen levies, how concentration on one wing could crack a line, how cavalry could be used as a real arm and not just as an escort. He returned home with a mind sharpened by observation and a country in crisis. Enemies pressed the borders. Claimants to the throne multiplied. Macedon looked like meat to be carved. Philip began with survival in view and ended with ambition satisfied. He made peace with those he could not yet fight, bought time with gifts, and struck hard where the situation demanded. He reformed the army in ways that changed the grammar of Greek warfare. Peasants were trained and drilled into a phalanx that carried long pikes called sarissas. The length of the sarissa created a bristling hedge that could receive a charge and drive forward with terrible effect. The king equipped and paid these men from royal revenues and from the yields of new mines. Around the phalanx he gathered a professional guard, known as the foot companions, and a striking arm of horse called the companion cavalry. He kept elite troops, the hypaspists, as a hinge between horse and pike. Siege craft became a Macedonian art. Engineers built rams and towers. The king invested in torsion artillery that could throw stones and bolts to crack walls and panic defenders. Campaigns became less seasonal and more deliberate. Macedon went to war as a state with a standing instrument. Diplomacy marched with the phalanx. Philip married widely and strategically, taking brides from Thessaly, Epirus, and elsewhere, binding though not always pacifying noble houses. He proclaimed friendship to the Amphictyonic Council that managed Delphi and other Panhellenic matters, and later secured a seat there as a penalty against enemies. His voice in that sacred forum allowed him to dress intervention as piety. He settled Thessalian quarrels and was elected Tagus of Thessaly, which placed Thessalian cavalry at his service and opened the road south. He courted Greek cities with gifts and justified threats with legal forms. Athens found in him a wily antagonist. The orator Demosthenes warned in speech after speech that Macedon was no friend of autonomy and that each concession would invite the next. Others in the Athenian assembly, tired of war and tempted by promises of security for grain routes and trade, preferred negotiation. The peace of Philocrates brought a breath of quiet along with bitter debates over its terms and sincerity. In the north and east, Philip eliminated the rivals who could have tied down his hands when he turned south. He took Amphipolis with its access to timber and to the gold of Mount Pangaean, then turned that gold into coin that paid troops and purchased loyalty. He besieged and broke Olynthus on the Chalcidic Peninsula when its citizens wavered between friendship and fear. He reorganized the region according to his interests and moved men where they would serve as props rather than as threats. The habit of clemency when it served him and severity when it deterred others gave his opponents one more topic for disagreement. Was he a civilizer in a rough land or a destroyer in Greek clothes? A holy quarrel offered the path south. The Third Sacred War began as a dispute over fines for alleged offenses against the sanctuary at Delphi. The Phocians seized the sacred treasury to hire mercenaries and fought with ferocity to keep their plunder and their place. The conflict dragged in Thebans, Thessalians, and others. Philip presented himself as the champion of Apollo and the friend of order. He defeated Phocian armies in the field and took a decisive victory on the Crocus Field, where he captured enemy troops in their thousands. The Amphictyonic Council, now under influence friendly to him, punished Phocis by stripping it of votes and giving those votes to Macedon. A king now sat as arbiter of sacred law in the very body that Greeks had long used to tell themselves they shared a world. Athens wavered between accommodation and alarm. Demosthenes composed his Philippics to rouse a tired city. He spoke of Philip's speed and flattery, his habit of promising one thing and doing another, his reach into Thessaly and then into central Greece. He called Greeks to a common cause. He faced colleagues who distrusted Thebes and doubted the willingness of other cities to stand. Meanwhile, Philip extended fortresses, placed garrisons in strategic passes, and maintained a network of informants and sympathizers. He was not a romantic conqueror. He was a political soldier who read maps and men with equal skill. The final test came when Philip moved into central Greece under the pretext of protecting Delphi and its roads once more. The Thebans, long rivals of Athens, now found reason to link shields with their old enemy against the greater danger. Alliances shifted with the speed that only fear of a single man can produce. The combined army of Thebes and Athens marched to meet the Macedonians in Boeotia, near a town called Chaeronea. The field was well chosen for phalanx and cavalry. Philip placed himself on the Macedonian right, and his son Alexander, not yet 20, on the left with the companion cavalry. The Theban Sacred Band, a corps famed for its discipline and bonds, anchored the Allied right. The battle revealed the machine that Philip had built. On the right, he advanced, and then deliberately gave ground on a slope, drawing the Athenians forward and loosening their line. On the left, Alexander drove hard at the sacred band, and the companions broke through with the weight that horse and courage can deliver when a gap appears. The Athenian line collapsed under pressure and confusion. The sacred band fought where it stood and died where it fought. Chaeronea was not the greatest battle by numbers fought on Greek ground, but it was decisive in another way. It ended a century of city-centered independence as a practical framework for power. There would still be assemblies, festivals, and civic pride. Decisions about war and peace would now be made at a Macedonian court. Philip did not ravage Athens. He respected its dead, returned prisoners without ransom, and sent the bones of fallen Athenian citizens home under escort. He understood that legitimacy mattered, and that Athens, with its theater of persuasion and its fleet of talented artisans, could be useful as a partner under pressure rather than as a humbled enemy. He summoned the cities to Corinth and established a league that bound them to a common peace and to a common war against Persia. The league swore oaths to respect constitutions and to settle disputes by arbitration. It also swore to follow Philip as leader of the campaign, to avenge earlier invasions and to carry Greek arms across the straits. Macedonian hegemony now wore a pan-Hellenic cloak. Behind the diplomatic fabric stood the iron threads of garrison and road. Philip placed commanders in key posts. He married once more to tie Epirus into his design, taking as bride the sister of a young Epirote prince who would become famous in his own right. He reorganized the finances of his kingdom to support an expeditionary army. He called engineers and builders to prepare bridges and siege engines for the war he had promised. The ports of the Hellespont were folded into his system. Grain routes were secured by friendship or fear. Greek mercenaries, who once sold their spears to any bidder, now found the best wages under a single banner. At a festival in Aigai, while actors performed and nobles gathered, the king walked between statues of the gods to celebrate his power and the Pan-Hellenic cause. A young Macedonian noble named Pausanias stepped forward and struck him down. The court erupted. Speculation began at once. Family intrigues and personal grievances offered motives enough. Foreign plots were whispered. Some pointed at Olympias, the queen whose will could cut like a knife, others at men who had chafed under the king's control. The truth sat behind a wall of the dead. What mattered for the world beyond the palace was that a youth who had led the cavalry at Chaeronea now put his hand on the reins of a forged machine. Philip had looked east. He had drilled men to move as parts of a larger intention. He had taught Greeks to fear less the quarrels among cities and to fear more the reach of a single crown. In his wake stood a league with oaths on tablets and garrisons in fortresses, an army ready for embarkation, and a prince who had learned from his father to speak in gifts and steel. The Greek world had been reordered, not by votes alone and not by fear alone, but by a new combination of wealth, technology, diplomacy, and ruthlessness that had outflanked the old civics of the polis. When Philip fell at Aigai, the machine he had built did not pause for mourning. Alexander took the oath of the Macedonian army, secured the nobles with swift rewards and reminders, and rode south to make the Greek cities understand that the settlement of Corinth still stood. Thebes tested him first. Rumors of his death emboldened the city to revolt, and envoys explored the chances of a wider coalition. Alexander moved with a speed that turned rumor into shock. He appeared before the walls in late summer and offered terms. Thebes refused. The assault that followed broke the city's resistance. Thebes was destroyed, its population sold or scattered, its territory assigned to neighbors. The message was direct. The common peace would be kept, and the Macedonian crown would enforce it. With Greece quiet, Alexander turned to the project that had filled the last years of his father's planning. The army crossed the Hellespont in spring, throwing a spear into Asian sand in the old rite, and running to the hill called Ilium to honor the hero whose name his family loved to claim. At the Granicus River, he struck the first Persian field army he met. The Persian commanders placed their cavalry forward and their Greek mercenaries behind. In a bold frontal push across dangerous water, Alexander led the companion cavalry against the line of Persian nobles. The charge unseated commanders and shook the cohesion of the host. The mercenaries fought hard but were overwhelmed. The victory opened Western Asia Minor to a campaign that moved from city to city, toppling satraps and inviting Greek polius on the coast to become free under Macedonian protection. Darius, now awake to the danger, gathered a royal army and chose Issus as the ground for his stand. There, the mountains squeezed the field so that numbers could not fully deploy. Alexander angled his cavalry to the right and looked for the moment when the Persian left would thin. When it did, he drove in with the companions, while the Macedonian phalanx absorbed pressure along the center. Darius fled the field and left family and treasure behind. The victory gave Alexander control of Syria and the Levant, but one city refused the easy submission that spared others. Tyre sat on an island just offshore and trusted in its sea walls and the tradition that no conqueror could touch it without a fleet. Alexander ordered a causeway built from the shore to the island. He brought siege towers to the waterline and used artillery to clear defenders from the parapets. He collected ships from conquered ports until he could challenge Tyrian triremes in their own roadstead. After months of labor and losses, the walls were breached and the city was stormed. The harsh sack that followed was a warning to other strongholds. The engineering feat that made it possible was a lesson. Macedon had learned to reduce walls as well as to break lines in the open field. Egypt opened its gates. The old order in Memphis and along the river had little reason to die for a Persian king. Alexander visited the oracle at Siwa, where priests addressed him with welcomes fit for a son of a god. He surveyed the shore between sea and river and sighted a new city at the Nile's mouth, drawn on a plan that gave harbors, shelter, and market space. Alexandria became the most famous of his foundations, a ladder between Africa and the Mediterranean, and a place where Greek language and Egyptian record would later meet in libraries and museums that tried to collect the whole world in scrolls. The last and greatest set piece came on the plain of Gaugamela. Darius arrayed a host sharpened for the occasion. The ground had been cleared to favor scythed chariots. Cavalry massed on the wings. Alexander again placed himself with the companions on the right. He edged that wing outward to draw Persian riders away from the center and then drove at the gap that formed near the king. Once more, Darius fled. Once more, the heart of the empire cracked. Babylon opened its gates. Susa yielded treasure that paid decades of wages. The palaces at Persepolis, storehouses of ceremony and archives of empire, were taken and burned after a debate that still echoes in the sources about whether the fire was a plan, a drunken act, or a symbol that Greece had avenged earlier invasions. Beyond the Persian capitals, the campaign turned from conquest into pursuit and then into exploration. Bessus, a satrap who had seized the Persian title, tried to hold the northeast. Alexander crossed the passes into Bactria and Sogdiana and found a war different from the set battles of the west. Forts on crags resisted. Local kings shifted allegiance by season. Macedonian engineers built ladders up impossible slopes. The king married Roxane, daughter of a noble from the region, and set a pattern he would repeat by drawing local elites into his circle. He took to wearing elements of Persian dress at court and expected prostration in ceremonial settings, a custom that made Macedonian companions bristle. He recruited Persian and other Asian cavalry into his ranks, and he trained infantry from the subject peoples to stand alongside the Macedonian phalanx. He held mass weddings at Susa between Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen to bind families across the new empire. The gesture charmed some and chilled others. It was a visible answer to the question of what this empire was meant to be. In India, he pressed as far as the Punjab. At the Hydaspes River, the king faced Porus, a ruler with skilled infantry and cavalry, and with elephants that terrified horses unused to them. Alexander feinted upstream and ferried a strike force across the river in a stormy night. The battle that followed tested the flexibility of the Macedonian system. The companions cut at the wings while the phalanx managed the slow pressure of elephants and infantry. The victory brought alliance rather than ruin. Alexander gave Porus his kingdom back and added land to it, a decision that shows how much he preferred friendly kings to hostile garrisons when the frontier was far from the Aegean. When the army reached the Bees, the rank and file refused to march farther. They had followed their king for 8 years. They had won cities whose names still sounded new in their mouths. They wanted to turn their faces toward home. Alexander sulked for 3 days, then yielded and began the long return. Part of the army sailed down the Indus under Nearchus to chart coasts and harbors. Part slogged through the Gedrosian desert and left bones behind in salt flats and dunes. Babylon welcomed the army back to the center of the New World. There, the king planned fresh campaigns into Arabia and administrative reforms that would make the fabric of the empire hold. He appointed satraps, many of them Persians or other locals supervised by Macedonian officers. He called engineers to survey canals and harbors. He set scribes to new registries. Then he fell sick in early summer and died, still short of 33 years old. The cause is uncertain in the surviving accounts. Fever and wine play their parts in different versions. The more important fact is what death did to the unity of the realm. He left an infant son by Roxane and a half-brother who was mentally unfit to rule. He left no adult heir who could speak with his authority. The generals who had shared his tent and copied his motions met to divide responsibilities. They agreed on guardianship of the royal house in name and on provinces in practice. The settlement made in Babylon and revised at Triparadisus soon unraveled. The successors fought for a generation in wars that filled the map with marching arrows. Antigonus Monophthalmus tried to gather the whole under one hand and nearly succeeded. Ptolemy settled on Egypt, made Alexandria his capital, and learned to use Nile flood and Greek law together. Seleucus won the heartlands of Asia and founded cities from the Tigris to Bactria. Lysimachus held Thrace and parts of Asia Minor. Cassander kept Macedon for a time and rooted out the royal house. When the dust settled after the Battle of Ipsus, the Hellenistic world took its enduring shape. The Antigonids ruled in Macedon and later in Greece. The Seleucids held the vast belt of Asia. The Ptolemies governed Egypt, the richest of the kingdoms, with grain ships that fed cities across the sea. A smaller but remarkable realm rose at Pergamon under the Attalids, patrons of learning and skilled in the art of surviving between larger neighbors. In the East, Greek kings in Bactria and later in India minted their own coins and blended customs for a century before horse archers and new migrations crushed them. Koine Greek became the language of trade and administration from the Levant to the Nile and from the Aegean to the Tigris. Cities founded or refounded by Macedonian officers acted as nodes in networks of soldiers, merchants, philosophers, and artisans. Alexandria in Egypt became the showpiece of this world. The museum was a community of scholars with stipends and rooms, an invention that allowed sustained attention to texts and nature. The library collected books aggressively, copying papyrus rolls, so that even ships that docked in harbor might find their store of writings inspected and duplicated. In its precincts, Euclid wrote a geometry that would shape classrooms for 2,000 years. Eratosthenes measured the circumference of the Earth with shadows and distances and came close to the real number. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth circled the Sun and that the stars were very far away. Archimedes, working in Syracuse and visiting Alexandria, wrote on levers and buoyancy while designing clever engines to defend his city. The poet Callimachus wrote hymns while he catalogued the library. The era's science and letters did not make a golden age by accident. They stood on money, storage, and the will of kings who liked to be patrons as well as war leaders. Armies changed with the age. The phalanx grew heavier and deeper, its pike longer still. War elephants marched with Seleucid kings and with Indian allies, and threw panic into horses and men who had never heard such trumpeting before. The companion model of decisive cavalry remained, but its handling often depended on the skill of a single commander. Siegecraft advanced still further. Cities that relied on walls alone learned that towers and rams could break stone given time, and that negotiation was often cheaper than starving behind gate bars. With wealth and science came instability. Courts were households writ large, full of cousins and claimants, tutors and guards. Succession could be orderly for a few reigns, and then collapse in a storm of murders. The kingdoms fought over borders along the Taurus Mountains, over Syria and its coastal ports, and over Asia Minor's rich river valleys. A new power watched these quarrels with a patient eye. Rome had fought Carthage for mastery of the Western Sea. It had learned to sail and to legislate for provinces. It had also learned to value Greek letters, even as it measured Greek divisions. Rome first touched the Greek mainland as an ally. When Philip V of Macedon aligned with Carthage, Rome carried war across the Adriatic. The first conflict ended with limited terms. The second ended on hills called Cynocephali, where a Roman commander named Flamininus used the flexibility of the legion to break the long pike front of the Macedonian phalanx. The maniples could wheel and fold in ways a phalanx could not when ground was broken and the line uneven. Flamininus proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks at the Isthmian Games, a formula that sounded sweet and carried a hook. Freedom depended on Roman favor and on Roman soldiers willing to sail when needed. The Third Macedonian War finished the matter. Perseus, last of the Antigonids to rule in Macedon with strength, fell at Pydna when the legion again found the gap between pikes and poured into the joints of the formation. The kingdom was dissolved into regions, then remade as a Roman province. In 146, a Roman army sacked Corinth, the city whose merchants had once driven the politics of seas that now belonged to others. In that same year, Rome crushed the last Carthaginian resistance in Africa. The Mediterranean had a new master. Egypt lasted longer, The Ptolemies kept the Nile tax rolls full and built temples in old forms with new inscriptions. They also quarreled among themselves and invited foreign guardians when civil strife ran hot. Cleopatra VII tried to hold a dangerous balance with charm and ships. She allied with Caesar and later with Antony, and made Alexandria a rival to Rome in the language of glory. The showdown came at Actium, where Octavian's admiral Agrippa trapped and ground down the Eastern fleet. Alexandria fell the next year. Cleopatra died. Egypt passed into Roman hands. The last great Hellenistic court became a set of offices under a prince who called himself the son of a god and who preferred to be called Augustus in public. What Alexander began outlasted his blood and his plans. Greek words filled markets and courts from Cyrenaica to the Euphrates. Greek teachers instructed Jewish scholars in Alexandria and princes in Bactria. The gods traveled too. Isis and Serapis found devotees on distant shores. The forms of Greek city life persisted under kings and then under Roman governors. The phalanx ended as a force on fields that did not suit it, but the habit of thinking in terms of citizens and laws and debates survived long enough to be adopted and adapted by a republic that had begun as a village among 7 hills. The world that emerged from Alexander's campaigns was not a single empire. It was a space in which people could move with common tools of speech and count, and in which ambitions could be imagined at a scale that made both libraries and legions feel necessary.